Welcome to another edition of the Here We Go podcast. I am your host, Trent Ging. Today we're going to be discussing the long shots to make the 53-man roster. So I'm going to lay out a little bit of ground rules here. I consider long shots guys who haven't been on an opening day roster, on a 53-man roster for a team before. Guys who don't have extensive experience in the NFL. So I'm really kind of looking at guys who were recently drafted. I've used 6th round or later as long shots. Sometimes 5th round guys can fit into that category, but typically it's 6th round or later. Undrafted free agents who don't have NFL experience. That's really what I'm going to be digging into today. So let's get this thing going. I'm going to start out with the guy who is as close to a lock as anybody who's going to be on this list. Beanie Bishop, undrafted free agent from WVU. He's been an outside corner. He's going to be moving inside this in the NFL. Says he models his game after Mike Hilton. Now, if this guy can give us even a portion of what Mike Hilton was, he's going to give himself a shot. The Cam Sutton suspension being 8 games now is really going to open this door for any one of these guys who are battling for that slot cornerback spot. And Beanie Bishop is going to be right in the thick of things. It's interesting to me that a guy who is an undrafted free agent is being talked about the way he's been talked about so far throughout minicamp and OTAs. I try to listen to the guys who are there on scene, who are reporting and giving their thoughts and feedback on what they're seeing on the field. And it's really difficult to judge the play of somebody when it's football and shorts. But I personally believe one of the positions you really can judge fairly effectively are the wide receivers and the corners, because they're going to do a lot of the same duties as once the pads come on. Now, of course, things do get different when you put the pads on. People are going to be more physical with you. You can tackle. You can play a lot more physical brand of bump and run because you have something to kind of grab onto where you don't necessarily have something to grab onto with the shoulder pads not being on. So I want to see if Beanie can hold up once the pads come on the same way that he's held up so far throughout OTAs and minicamp. I think Latrobe's going to go a long way toward him having a chance to not only make this team, but possibly even be a starter, especially for the first 8 weeks of the season. Now, something I did not know about Beanie that I also think works in his favor is his last season at Western Kentucky, he returned kicks. And he had a little over a 21-yard average returning kicks. That's another thing that might be intriguing because we're looking at Cordero Patterson, and we don't know what's behind him right now. There's guys who you could look at. Jalen Warren has said he wanted to do it. Quez Watkins is another guy maybe you look at. Calvin Austin III is another guy you maybe look at to do it. But I think it's interesting that Beanie Bishop has done it before in college, because we don't have a lot of people on our team that's actually even done it at all, college or pro. So even if he's a fringe guy, if he can show he can bring some value there, that's just one more thing that you could kind of stack in his book to make the argument that he should be on the 53-man roster. We'll see if that plays a factor or not. It may not at all. But I just found it intriguing because I honestly didn't even know he had done it before. So if something happens to Patterson, who's the next guy to step up to take his place? Could it be a guy like Beanie Bishop, or do they want to put a guy like Calvin Austin III? Returning kicks and returning punts are two totally different things. Some people think if you're good at one, you could do the other. It's not necessarily true. It's two totally, especially with this new kickoff rule, it's not going to be the same thing. So it'll be interesting to see if that plays a factor at all. But even if it doesn't, I think he can make a strong case. The reporting is he's like the only rookie who was in camp that wasn't constantly having coaches talk to him about his positioning or what he's doing wrong here or what he's doing wrong there. He didn't have veterans talking to him in his ear all the time. He was out there making plays, and he was putting himself in very good position. Positioning in the NFL is a big piece to the puzzle. You have to be in the right position all the time. Coach Tomlin talks about this repetitively. Do the routine things routinely. If Beanie Bishop continues that through Latrobe, and he continues making plays like a lot of these PBUs that he keeps coming up with in camp, he not only has a chance to make this team, but he's really going to put himself in as a front runner to start. Now, he is competing against a guy who has experience and has experience in the slot, and Josiah Scott. There's other guys on the team that they brought in who have some experience, not extensive experience. I think there's a real shot, and I'm rooting for Beanie Bishop. I've said it before. I'll say it again, probably another time, but after this. There's a real shot Beanie Bishop not only makes this team, but he's starting week 1 as the slot corner. And if he plays well enough, I think there's a shot that he could continue to have playing time, significant playing time, even when Cam Sutton comes back. The Steelers want a guy who can be a long-term option at slot corner. And depending on how he plays in camp, maybe he could be that guy. I don't know. We'll see. You can't guarantee anything. You can't predict anything at this time of year. You got to see the pads come on. You got to see how they play in the practices at camp and Latrobe. You got to see how they do in the preseason games. But I absolutely want to see if Beanie shows a strong camp. I want to see that guy going against ones in preseason. Don't just play the veteran guy. And I keep saying this, especially with like the offensive line. I talked about it. Sometimes you can't just baby people. You gotta do trial by fire. And I feel like the slot cornerback position is going to be that for whoever ends up being the starter. You need a little trial by fire in the preseason. So Beanie Bishop, I think, is a lock to make this roster right now. If you look at it right now, and he brings some intriguing traits to the table. So the second guy I'm going to talk about is also in the secondary. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of the long shots are on the defense, more so than the offense. It feels like the offense is a lot more set in stone. So let's go to the defensive side of the ball and a guy who was playing corner who's now moving to safety, and Ryan Watts. Now, Ryan Watts has very good size for a safety. He was oversized a little bit as a corner. His flat line speed and his foot quickness aren't quite what it needs to be to play corner in the NFL. All of his projections going into the NFL draft were for him to move to safety. And he did play safety in the East-West Shrine Bowl. His RAS score was high. I mean, he had a really good score. I think it was like 9.12 once the bench press, or not 9.21, something like that. Once they got the bench press on records, it was much higher than that before his bench press. He didn't have a very good bench press, but he also is very long. And I don't personally, I don't count the bench press as like the end all be all for guys who are 6'3", lanky guys, because that's a long way to push that weight up. Much different than a guy who's 5'8" with short arms. So athletically, he's a very athletic guy. He's a very willing hitter. He can bring the boom. He's a short tackler. These are things that you look for in the safety position. Now, his ball skills aren't great. And I think that's why the team's moving him and letting him be taken under the wing of DeShon Elliott, is because they want him to learn more of that box safety role. That role that like Terrell Edmunds played. They're going to need him to develop ball skills a little bit more. And it's going to be an adjustment for him either way. Changing positions is not easy. As a rookie, it's not easy. As a 6th round rookie, it's very not easy. His clear path to making this roster is going to be through special teams. Now, he's played special teams all through college. He's going to bring a little bit of pedigree there. Yes, college is vastly different from the NFL, but there's a lot of guys who come into the NFL who's never played special teams or haven't played very much on special teams, to where it is a learning curve for them. That's not going to be the case for Ryan. Ryan's going to have that in his back pocket already. He's going to be focusing on developing as a safety. I don't expect him to really bring any value this year as a safety, but as a developmental piece for as athletic as he is. I mean, he was a 4-star recruit coming out. He went to Ohio State as a 4-star recruit. They liked him. They had a couple guys with experience in front of him. He couldn't quite get as much playing time as what he wanted. And then they had a couple guys coming in behind him. He was in a kind of a crowded room. I actually thought he would have started his junior year if he stayed. He chose to leave, go to Texas, and that is what it was. Well, actually, he would have been a redshirt freshman. It was 3rd year college either way. He chose to leave, go to Texas. He went back home. That's where he was from anyway. Totally understandable move. And he had a solid 2 seasons there. So tackling numbers were good. Special teams numbers were good. It's just he didn't create as many turnovers as what you would like. He had more turnovers actually as a reserve in Ohio State than he had as a starter at Texas, which I found pretty interesting. But nevertheless, he's changing positions. It's going to be a totally different way of looking at the ball. And I think if you listen to what Patrick Peterson said about his transition last year and trying to work that out, which was kind of a makeshift thing. It wasn't like a thing he got to work on full time or anything. But he talked about the challenges of it and how different it really was. So if it's challenging for a guy who's a future Hall of Fame guy, just take into consideration what it's going to be for a guy like Ryan Watts. So he's going to make his mark on special teams. I think he has a solid chance of making the team. It's going to depend on how many corners we keep versus how many safeties we keep. But if he really shows he's going to be a strong special teams guy, there's a path, a clear path for him to make this roster. He could be the 4th safety on this team. I thought Trenton Thompson was going to be the 4th safety, but with him being gone, I think it opened up an opportunity for Ryan Watts to establish himself as the 4th safety on this roster. Or I'm sorry, he'd be the 5th safety on this roster. Because you're going to have the 3 that play, barring ridiculous injury and suspensions like we had last year. But you're going to have Minkah, you're going to have KZ, and you're going to have Elliott as your 3 guys that are going to be in that 3 safety package. They're going to be the top 3 safeties who get the majority of the playing time. Killebrew is going to come in ahead of him right now. But Watts can make the roster as that 5th safety on the team and be a special teams guy. So it'll be interesting if they keep him rostered. But 5 safeties is a lot a lot to keep on a roster. So it'll just be interesting to see how they play that out. We'll see what they do with that. So I do think there's a path for him to make the roster. It's not nearly as clear-cut as Beanie Bishop's clear path, but you can definitely see where he has a chance to make this team. It's all going to be based on what he does and what he shows he develops as a safety. So sticking with guys drafted in the 6th round, another guy on the defensive side of the ball is Logan Lee. Now, Logan Lee, I think, has a very, very muddy outlook at how he could possibly make this roster. He does not have a clear path in the same way as either Watts or Bishop. He's got a very steep uphill climb, in my opinion. Logan Lee is undersized. He was projected as a 3-4 defensive end. He had a very solid RAS score. I think he was the one that was at 9.12. But his weight at 281 pounds is what he was listed at the combine. That's very small for a defensive end in the NFL. He's going to have to put on probably 15 pounds. And his strength and his play strength, not just his outright strength, his play strength is not good. He's going to need to learn to use his hands better. He doesn't have great pass rush prowess. He had 3 sacks the last couple of seasons at Iowa. So his quickness off the ball doesn't jump off the tape. I mean, that was a knock on him. So for a guy who can get caught up on run blocks and not get off blocks, a guy who doesn't have a ton of pass rush ability, is a guy who's definitely a long shot to make this roster. And so I think this guy is a guy who likely is going to be a practice squad type player who needs to develop and gain weight and build on his body size because he has the frame to put the weight on. He's, I think, 6'5", and he's pretty stout. He just needs to gain more weight and put the strength on behind that weight to have a better shot at playing in the NFL. So his athleticism is something that you like, and it was very clear in this draft that the Steelers had a game plan going into this. They wanted guys who were very athletic. Pretty much everybody's RAS score from our draft class was I think every one of them was over 9. They were all considered athletic players. They're clearly starting to look at a prototypical type of player they want for all positions. And when you hear of a guy like Keanu Benton, another guy like Brandon Fiocco, who are trimming weight to play faster and play more athletic, that's where I look at a guy like Logan Lee and I say, man, if he could put 10 to 15 pounds on and build more strength behind that frame, you could see potentially where he could be a guy who ends up making the roster. I'm just not sure it's going to be this year. He's going to have a lot of guys in front of him who are going to be favored ahead of him. Number one, obviously, being DeMarvin Leal. If DeMarvin Leal comes to camp and shows out that he could be the guy that we thought he had the potential to be as a rookie, that's somebody you could look at and say, yeah, he's definitely going to make the roster. If Isaiah Loudermilk comes into camp and he starts showing he's developing into the guy that they wanted him to be when they drafted him, you could say he could make the roster. Dean Lowry didn't have good numbers last year, but he does have good pedigree behind him and a good history in his career of being a solid player. And for a role player, you don't need anything spectacular. He could be a guy to make the roster. Fehoko could be another guy who makes the roster. I mean, Fehoko's probably going to be looking at a nose tackle spot. But there's a lot of guys on that defensive line that they could look to keep that's going to push Logan Lee off this roster. There's only so many spots and only so many roster guys that they're going to keep on that defensive line. So I personally don't think Logan Lee is going to be a guy this year that we're going to look at as someone who's going to make the 53-man. I think he's a guy that you're going to look at as a project type guy that if he can put the weight on and if he can build the strength behind that weight and play stronger, you may look at him next season as a guy competing for a roster spot. But I put him on the list because he's an intriguing guy with his athletic ability. So I think he's a guy who's potential, but not likely. The wide receiver room. I think you can pretty much include everybody in the wide receiver room on this list. If you're in Latrobe and you're wearing a jersey, you have a shot to play wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, if you make a nice grab from a ball thrown into the stands, they may give you a shot. We just have nobody in that room. It is just terrible behind George Pickens. Dez Fitzpatrick's going to be the interesting guy because he's been a special teams guy before. He's dressed a couple of times. If he just doesn't make mistakes and makes enough plays, he's a guy you could look at as somebody who's a potential to make this roster that maybe nobody's really giving enough credit for. Now, I'm not sure I believe Dez will make the roster. I think it's less likely that he makes the roster than what maybe you would think he could be because he's been around the organization for a couple of years now. But he is a different body type. He's a different type of route runner. And when you talk about some of the guys, they have very similar games. I mean, Calvin Austin and Quez Watkins are all based on speed. Everything about them is speed. They're take the top off the defense type guys, not great route runners underneath. So that's kind of two of the same player in a lot of respects. Van Jefferson's another guy. When you first talk about him, but you talk about his speed, he does have very good speed, tested very well at the 40. He's a more defined route runner. He has more of a prototypical body as far as his build. He's the guy that should be the front runner for the wide receiver 2 spot, but I'm not sure if he's going to make enough plays in camp to really be the wide receiver 2. Scotty Miller is going to be in the mix. Like, I just think anybody who shows out in camp at the wide receiver position has a shot. Now, Roman Wilson's going to be a lock to make the team because he's your third-round rookie. But behind him, anybody else on the wide receiver room has a shot of both making the team and being cut. So I think it opens the door for a guy like Dez Fitzpatrick, who already brings special teams value. The only special teams value Austin brings is punt returning. Quez Watkins has not been a special teams guy in his career. Van Jefferson's not been a special teams guy in his career. It does open a door for Dez Fitzpatrick, and I think there's an opportunity for him to show that he can make enough plays. Now, he's not a take the top off the defense kind of guy. He's more of a possession guy, but you can make an argument that Fitzpatrick can make this team. It's just such an uncertain room. I don't expect him to make the team, but I think he's a guy to watch in camp because there is a potential for him to make the team. There is a path. And when I was doing this list, I really wanted to look at guys who have a path, and he definitely has a path. The last guy I want to talk about is Jeremiah Moon. Now, Jeremiah Moon is undersized, very similar to Nick Herbig. He has experience in the NFL. He's played a little bit for the Ravens. It was primarily due to injuries, not because he showed out in camp or practices or whatever. But he's a very athletic guy. Again, another guy that Pittsburgh's valuing to bring onto this roster to give a shot because of his athletic ability. There is no one who's going to be that fourth outside linebacker on the roster right now. It is a wide open competition. Personally, I think the most likely scenario is that we bring in a veteran. I don't think that we are going to have anybody who's on the current roster as the guy who ends up being that fourth linebacker in the room. I could be completely wrong on that, but I just feel like if you're going to make a move, TJ Watt has missed time before. Alex has missed a couple of games here and there, not nearly as much as TJ has. You're going to want a little bit of insurance at that position. And I don't know that you're going to trust David Perales or Jeremiah Moon or anyone else who's on the roster right now. You're going to want to bring a veteran guy in. Possibly Golden comes back. I would love to have that guy back. He played very well. And I think the most important piece to this is he is a different body type than Nick Herbig. You need another guy who's going to have a little bit of size to his frame to play that position, especially when you get to Baltimore, especially when you get to Cleveland. You know they're running the ball with some big bruising dudes. Herbig, I personally like Nick Herbig a lot, but I do not want to see Nick Herbig versus Derrick Henry. It's not going to end well for us. So I think you do need a guy who's got a little more meat on the bone, which is where I think Jeremiah Moon's potential to make the roster gets a little bit murky. But again, there is nobody in that. It is going to be an open competition. I think there's potential for him. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. These are kind of the guys I zeroed in on. Again, just because I think there's a realistic chance. There's other guys you can make an argument for. You could have talked about the running back room. But that running back room, you're going to get to backs on backers before that plays itself out. That backs on backers drill is exactly how Jaylen Warren made the team. That's where you're going to find out what the running back room has. And you've got 3 guys already who are locks to make the team. Do they even roster a 4th guy? Maybe, maybe not. Probably anybody else competing is going to be looking at a practice squad spot. So I didn't want to go that route. There's other positions you could look at to make arguments for, but they're just probably not really a clear path for any of those guys. So let me know what you guys think. If you agree with my list, if you disagree with my list, if you disagree with my take on the list, please like, share, subscribe, and let me know how you feel. I'm ready for camp. Everybody have a great day.